Okay. So at the very beginning, I appreciate Professor Mann's your presence. So to be honest, this is my first time to host such an activity. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And so generally, the interview is divided into two parts. The first section is related to our course content, some extended question about our schoolwork. While the second is some of your ideas about general literature. So probably I watched some of your TV shows and some of your book introduction, but I've never bought books. I've never bought your books, but I've read some brief introductions. So I got some ideas if you're general thinking in this book, so I may mention it in the meeting if you approve it. To mention it. So the interview today may contains about 15 questions, so which I assume will take more than 1 hour. I will attempt to limit the time under an hour and a half, so I make both of us feel relaxed. So you're not necessarily be serious or treating it as a normal meeting. Imagine it as you are having an office hour, where it's more like a conversation than a more formal meeting. So meanwhile, if you're having doubts or any questions, you can feel free to ask and to point it out. If you are worrying about your answers, so feel free to skip it or to stop it. Okay. So, if you're ready, we'll start the meeting. So the first part is generally about our schoolwork. So, we have read so many books for the past year, and we've been to several places and several continents involved. So my first question is about amount of books we have read for this year. Which one do you like the most, and what's the reason behind it? So the preference could be anything. So the type of the genre, the way the author wrote the poems, or even the symbolism. It depends on you. So from which way would you prefer? Which one do you prefer the most?
Tough question. It's like asking me to pick my favorite child. I think from the first term, oddly enough, probably Waiting for Godot. And I say oddly because it's a play, it's a script, and plays don't really come alive until you actually see them. But that particular play and that script is a rare exception to that rule, that it reads almost as well, in fact in some cases better, because I've seen it perform badly. I don't know, I just find it, as I think I said in the class, each time I read that thing, it seems to me more and more that there's absolutely no metaphors or symbols or allegories. It simply means exactly what it says. And I find the truth of that play more and more meaningful every year. And I got to say, especially this year, especially right now. I don't know if you remember about the end of the play where Vladimir says to Estragon, "I can't go on." And Estragon says, "That's what you think." Right? Because that's what we're doing right now. We're going on like this because that's what you do. From the second term, I'd probably say John McGregor's novel, If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things. I just find the prose like sort of almost achingly beautiful. I'm a sucker for a certain kind of sentimental is not quite the right word, but it's damn close. I just find it very moving. I've been studying English long enough now and thinking about books long enough that you can come up with the theory to explain why a particular piece of art is good. It's relatively easy to do that. You can defend anything as being good or bad. The only test I've found that actually works, your brain can fool you, your body cannot. And so when you read something and you actually feel it physically, I don't know, your heartbeat goes up, or you cry, or you tear up, or laugh, or the hair goes up in the back of your neck. Those things are real. And that book, despite the fact that I've read it maybe a dozen times, like it affects me physically. I find it that powerful. And those are my two favorites.
And I understand that the Waiting for Godot is more straightforward, like makes you like physical, and your asset, Vladimir, or estragon. You all like the characters or in the circumstance of them. And for John McGregor, it's more like you can ignore some of the methods that authors always convey their writing, but to focus on the words, on their meaning behind the words. Can I understand that as a way?
I mean, it's always going to be a combination of, you need two things, right? You need the story
Mm-hmm.
and you need the way it's told.
Mm-hmm.
And they both matter. So what it's about and how it's told seem to me to both matter. You could have trying to imagine an unappealing story told in a good way. It's possible. It's for me. It's some combination of the two, both the story itself, what it's about, and the way it's told. And I find the best books are always ones that it's a perfect marriage of those two things, right?
All right.
Excuse me.
All right. So next question is about like the books that we read for this year are mostly the author's first book, right? So like Leaf Storm, Remarkable Things, Monkey Beach, Things Fall Apart. So is this a coincidence or are you deliberate choosing them because of their debut of the authors? Do you think the author's debut marks their style on writing and to foreshadow their further work? Or you have any other idea on choosing their debut as our novels reading list?
Hadn't thought of that. I mean, I'd have to go through and count them to see if that's right, that they're mostly first books. You're right, there's a significant number of them that are first books, but I mean, Catherine LaRue's book is not her first book. Sarah Peters is not her first book. But you're right, there's something to that. I wasn't conscious. And some of those are books that I didn't pick, the canon picked. You see what I mean? Like Things Fall Apart. It's not me who decided that that's the novel we read by Chinua Achebe. It's kind of the world that's decided that, even though he himself kind of say, hey, I wrote other books. So but I think maybe subconsciously there might be two things at play there. One is that, the course is called Literature for Our Time. So a certain kind of youthfulness mattered to me. A youthfulness of outlook, and I don't necessarily mean youthfulness as in your age, or the student's age, but I mean the youthfulness of the perspective of the author. And so first books often have that. And then the other factor is that first books are often the best book. Just like first records are often the best record. And I think part of that comes from, when you're a band or a singer and you put out that first record, let's say you're 21 years old, you've had your entire life to think about all those songs. They've been stewing inside you for, your entire adult life. And then let's say it's a success. And then the record company says, okay, we need another record from you. And we need it in 6 months. You see what I mean? So that first work of art has a long time to gestate, and it's everything you are. And after that, it's work to keep going, to keep writing them. And so maybe inspiration strikes, maybe it doesn't. But I think there's likely a case to be made that first works of art are often the most. Not always, right? Not always. Sometimes it takes writers a time to figure. I mean, Garcia Marquez is a good example. Sure, Leaf Storm is his first book, but we didn't actually read Leaf Storm, right? We read the short stories that come after it. The Burial Man with Enormous Wings, and those things. Garcia Marquez took. It's been I'm going to say 10 or 15 years to find his way into that voice. So. Sometimes, but not always.
So, for you, like the first books are taking their longest time to finish, so they have a longer time to get used to their work styles, and it's probably they're perfect books.
Yeah, it's just something that, as a writer, you've been carrying inside you for years, as an artist. And you've been thinking about it and it's meaningful to you. And also, I think you're probably less constrained by the the market, by the expectations of your audience, right? You do one record or one book, and then your audience thinks that you're that kind of writer, and therefore you must write that kind of book or make that kind of song. The first one, you're an unknown. So,
Especially previous ones became extremely successful.
Mhm.
So your audience expectation is much higher than others.
Mhm.
So I find an interesting point that most of the readings are like, I cannot describe in a single word, but it's more like pathetic and mostly are tragic stories. So we witness the world becoming an Easter-egg patient lying on the bed. The orange is around us. We see the fading value of religion, masculinity, gender equality being compromised. So in modern time, we take our observations on our streets, looking for people while wondering what their positions are, Sasquatches in the pursuit of redemption. So the division of binary identities also appear. So why are this work you chose are so tragic or serious, rather than some positive works?
well, again, I don't think that's me. I think that's just art in general.
Mm.
That art in general, especially what we call high art, leans more towards the tragic than the comic. And if you want evidence for this, just look to the Academy Awards. It's pretty rare for a comedy to most films that make the best pictures of the year
Mhm.
on any list lean more towards pathos, sadness, than they do towards the comic. I don't know why that is. Maybe we're hardwired to see tragedy as more artistic than comedy. Higher form of art. I don't know. It's probably not right. Making good comedy is just as hard as making good tragedy, maybe even harder. But it is the way it is. I mean, essentially, it's not just my class. Essentially, every English class is an introduction to the history of depression. This a lot of sadness, and maybe that's because of taste. Maybe that's because when serious artists of any kind get to work, what they think about and what moves them are things that are to them tragic and sad. I don't. I guess I'm trying to dodge the question because I think art made this choice as much or more than I could have done the class entirely comedies, but that would just be perverse. That would be completely unrepresentative of the literature of our time, right? That would be just me bucking against the system, and I didn't want to do that. I mean, I think it's important to laugh. That's why Charlie Chaplin's there. That's why Beckett is there. That's why Chris Ware, in his own way, is there. But I think with art, what you're really trying to say is to another person is, look, here's something I've felt. Here's something I've experienced. Maybe you have as well. And those things that you feel most powerfully are most likely to be forms of loss, right? Bereavement, exile, Kinesia Lubrin's, exile from the diaspora, the African diaspora, the elegies in Sylvia Plath, Eliot's lament for the loss of a culture, Achebe's lament for the loss of a people, Jimmy Corrigan for his father. Those are the things that stick with you, loss. And so that's why our big stories, and not just in literature, right, in music, in painting, tend to be more about loss than about gain. Because, I don't know, maybe at some level, happiness is just kind of boring. Right? I wish that wasn't so, but happy people don't tend to write art, to make art, do they?
Yes.
Right?
I
don't know.
think so.
I'm not a writer myself, but the only poems I ever wrote was after I got dumped. You write poems about breakups. That's been 40 years, but I think loss is a more powerful producer of art than gain.
Okay.
Or contentment. Contentment doesn't produce art, because if you're content, you're content. You don't need anything else. Right? You don't need art.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, yeah, like another problem just emerged in my mind. Like, so what's your evaluation on Chaplin? So, is it a figure of combination of tragedy or comedy?
I guess it's a comedy, right? It is generically a comedy, and we know it's a comedy because things get better at the end, not worse, right? That's the definition of comedy: reconciling problems, bringing people together. So generically, it's a comedy. But each time I see it, I find it more sad than funny. There's something tremendously pathetic about the little tramp. And partly because we know that, okay, so he's getting together with his girl at the end, but they're not going to get rich. They're not even going to get middle class. Be poor. And the man is always going to be out to get them in one way or another. So maybe they have a little bit of a happy ending this time, but the system is still against them. And Chaplin knows that, and we know that. So I don't know. There's a sadness at the heart of Chaplin, which is probably true of all the best comedies. That that there's like it, So the definition of a tragedy ends with a funeral, and comedy ends with a marriage. That's the sort of stock definition, right? But the thing about a marriage is that it's just a divorce waiting to happen. There's always, or no, if not a divorce, then one of the partners is going to die before the other one does. So every comedy has embedded at the end of it the promise of the threat of a tragedy to come. The writer just stopped telling the story at that point. So there's always a sadness that is hidden underneath comedy.
So it means that comedy could be tragedy.
Yeah,
I didn't point it out.
All comedy is a tragedy that hasn't been written yet, right? It's the first chapter, and if you follow it through to the end, because every story ends in tragedy.
Okay, so the next question is about our first half of our course. So we put more focus on modernism on the first half, so which is a mark of the fading former poems and fragmented poems prevailed. So I Rasmus, I said back in the Wasteland, and it talks about me with the idea of imagism, futurism, and vorticism. Some of them are influenced by Eliot. So what do I think of the relationship between modernism and those ideas, and how does Eliot influence these authors? Because after I'm reading it, I know that they're influenced by Eliot, but I don't know how they're influenced by Eliot and how they're working in our modern time or in their time.
So sorry, you're asking like what's the influence of Eliot on futurism? Is that what
futurism, imagism, and vorticism.
Vorticism? Yeah. Short answer, I don't know. Yeah, I'd have to refresh my mind. Doesn't futurism precede Eliot? This isn't really my turf, so I don't really know the answer to that. The only general answer I can give you is that these terms, futurism, imagism, vorticism, even modernism, they're largely terms that were made up by critics and readers after the fact as a way of trying to generalize about a large and baggy monster. They're not. It's not like Eliot got up in the morning and said, I'm going to write a modernist poem. Eliot got up in the morning and said, I'm going to write a poem. And then afterwards, we gave it the name modernism. So it's hard for me to imagine any of those writers sort of consciously thinking of contributing to a particular movement. Writers take what they like and give what they can. I'm sorry, that's a bad answer, but I really don't know enough about those particular movements to be able to answer the question. It seems to me they all sort of, yeah, I guess Vorticism. When is Vorticism? 20s?
It's like it's more prevalent in printing, like mentioning like at the background of at the essays. Like,
Okay.
it's more like a wild and more powerful writing works. They're
I don't know. I associate it more with like Ezra Pound than with
yeah, there's
Eliot.
a pound.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a
But
pound is heavily influenced by Eliot, right?
yeah, yeah. They were well both ways. I would say Eliot was actually probably more influenced by Pound than the other way around. Pound did a lot of the edits on the Wasteland. He cut it down pretty substantially. But as I say, this is really not. I'm not a modernist, right? I'm just masquerading as one. I was hired as my specialty is Canadian literature, and so I teach books out of my field because I like teaching books out of my field, and because it's a big first year survey class. But I'm not an expert on that stuff, so I'm going to have to pass on that one.
Okay, all right. So for our second half semester, we pay more attention on recent works, right? So the binary meanings in Hadwick, the unstartedness people contained remarkable things. The opposition to gender equality, empowering the accountability of my actions. So I wrote in my final assignment that the unprecedented development speed of the society, but ignores people's emotions. Like the authors at this time became more confused than before. To doubt what is the future of this level of development. So how would it development alter people's minds? So this literature work, the literature works in our reading list review this problem, but the authors have no answer to these questions, like how to deal with the development of this people's minds and how they're changing people's minds. So all in all, what do you think of literature over time? So what is the characteristic and problem hidden behind this literature works or people at the time?
I think it'd be impossible to answer that with any one, characteristic, because the literature of our time is literature of our time, which is different than literature for our time. Is massive. I mean, there's never been so many books or so few readers. It's sort of weird that at this moment we've got more books than we ever did, and fewer people to read and buy them. So it's too varied to begin to. So what you do as a teacher is because you can't simply say that. You can't simply say, look, they're all just books and they're all different. You try to impose shape on it. You try to give it coherence. And you might be making that coherence up. You might be making that shape up. But it's a way of trying to give your students and yourself a narrative about our time and about the art of our time. And so the particular narrative, as you know, that I tend to follow in the second half is that there seems to me in the literature of and for our time to be a particular and marked concern with homelessness, with feeling homeless. And I don't mean necessarily physically homeless, though that comes up as well. I mean existentially, psychologically, right? Characters who don't feel at home even when they are at home. There's one novel that I used to do in the class, but we don't have it anymore. It's Miriam Toews' novel, A Complicated Kindness. And there's a lovely phrase in it where the main character says she's homesick at home. And that kind of sums up what I'm getting at. And I think, so some part of the reason why being homeless or looking for home is a concern as old as literature itself. This has always been a theme of literature and the arts. But I think right now that concern has changed and been amplified by the speed of our world, by how much more mobile we are, and therefore how much less rooted. I mean, you look at Virginia Woolf's The Lighthouse. Those people, as young adults, the children of the family, they're all still living in the same house as their parents, right? They're all still part of the same network. That is increasingly not true. Right? People are living all around the world. We don't live with our parents anymore. Some of us do, but many more of us don't. We're much more mobile. And so it's harder to know where home is, if you keep moving.
What do you think of being mobile? Is it a good thing or a bad thing for you?
It just is what it is. It's right now it looks like a bad thing, right? Maybe we should have all stayed home more. Yeah, we travel more, we move more. On some level, it's got to be, I think, on balance, a better thing than a bad thing. And what I mean by that is the ability of people to go elsewhere for better opportunities for themselves and their families. Also, the increased awareness of other ways of life that travel and living other places gives you. So on balance, I'd have to say a good thing. But I'm not a judge. I'm an interpreter. So, I just try to deal with what shows up. And what shows up seems to me one of the responses to literature of our time is to that predicament of homelessness. A lot of this is caused, too, by the fact that the course was conceived and to some extent still bears the mark of 9/11. Right? Everything was in the shadow of a world that had suddenly divided itself, or felt like it suddenly divided itself, and increasing anxiety about who your friends were and who to trust, anger, those sorts of things.
So the next question is just to fulfill my curiosity. So in the previous question, we mentioned that work. So we have read our filled with emotion, sadness, or depression. But there are some inspiration novels as well, which represent our modern time. Like what I've read, one of the most impressive novels is The Old Man, Sea by Hemingway. Jack London's The Call of the Wild. So during my childhood, I also heard stories from Helen Keller and her stories in 3 Days to See. So I know there are some other books that are encouraging, and the way of conveying those words are more positive. So what interests those? Like, I know the sadness is a mainstream, or it's a is the representation of literature. So, but why don't we have some more positive ones, or some inspirational or encouraging ones? Why?
Because this isn't a self-help class, right? I'm not a therapist. This is not a literature is not about improvement. I don't think. It's about sharing. That's all. It's just saying, I experienced this. This is how I represent it. Maybe you did too. Maybe you will connect with this as well. It's not self-improvement. That's a whole other. I'm also not certain. Old Man in the Sea really is doesn't he die?
Like, you mean the Old Man?
Yeah. I mean, how uplifting.
I don't know. Probably it's an open end. It's an open end question for you, for all readers. If you think he's alive, he's alive.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't find Hemingway terribly uplifting myself. I mean, it's the tragic. Helen Keller, sure, but that's autobiography and memoir, and she's writing with a purpose. Those are important books that give people purpose, books that help make their lives better, books that make them feel better. I got nothing against those books. They're just not what I do. And they're largely not what literature does. They have a different function. The purpose of art is just to move you. It's not to improve you. That's medicine.
Mm-hmm. Like, you're sharing those books in our real list to share your opinion towards literature of our time, but not the time. because the time combines so much any other factors.
Yeah, well, any syllabus is always going to be an exercise in selection, right? You know,
Hmm.
you're always choosing because you've only got 6 books in a term, and
Hmm.
there's billions of books.
Hmm.
So I, I mostly just choose them. I think just because they moved me, and I hope they'll move you.
Hmm.
That's all. That's all.
Indeed, they're moving me.
That's good.
Okay. So, so it's about a. So this is our first half section. So this next section is about your opinions towards probably some relationships with literature and some of your ideas towards literature. It's a general idea, not only about our course content, but also a general one. So first, it's like I reckon to you that you must be a music buff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a few years ago, Bob Dylan's lyrics are awarded a Nobel Prize of Literature. So in your opinion, what do you think of the relationship between music and literature? And how does music contribute to the development of literature?
On that particular case, I don't think there's anything wrong with Dylan getting the Nobel Prize. I just think they probably should have created one for. It's well past time that we had one for song lyrics, as opposed to giving him one for poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Because Dylan's a hell of a writer, but words written for the ear versus words written for the page are two different things, two different skills, and I think to give Dylan the Nobel. Is he going to be okay?
Oh, it's okay. It's just my roommate. Or you can go on.
Yeah. But sorry, the bigger question there was about the relationship between music
and literature.
I mean, the only things that pop into my head are first that each routinely feeds the other. So there's a long list of books that are inspired by music, that take inspiration from music, and there's a long list of songs that profit from books, that profit from reading, especially more serious songs, especially Dylan. I mean, I forget which. There's actually a Dylan song. I think it's called. I can't remember what the hell it's called now. It's like 15 minutes long. That's why I've never played it in the class. But it's a retelling of The Wasteland. I'm not a huge Dylan fan myself, but the other just general point I'd make is that as poetry became increasingly rarefied and increasingly written for the page, I think some of its primary pleasures, things like rhyme, sentiment, meter, they moved into popular music. So between the two forms, that once upon a time they were the same art, and then they split apart. One became one and emphasized more the words and the page. The other emphasized the ear and the sound. We still need rhyme. We still need narrative. We still need sentiment. We don't get it in poetry anymore. So now we get it in Taylor Swift.
Do you think is a good trend to switch from poetry to probably pop music, or
I think people take their comfort wherever they can find it. Who am I to say, right? If you get comfort from, Taylor Swift's probably not a good example, but I don't know, yeah.
Sheeran?
Well, I was actually something like Billie Eilish. I used to think if you were looking for music literature of and for our time, she seems to me to be kind of it, or much closer to it than a lot of poetry that's getting written right now. There's something about both her sound and her words that feels very now. But I'm 56 years old. What the hell do I know, right, about Billie Eilish? Right? So.
Oh, really? Yeah. You still have a young heart.
I'm a music junkie. Like I've been. Most people's musical tastes harden about 23, 24. I used to work as a DJ, various kinds. I did like everything from weddings and bar mitzvahs up to fairly significant parties, raves. Ooh. And when you work as a DJ, you learn pretty quickly that the way to make a crowd happy, especially a crowd of drunks, you just look at the age of the people in the room and you go back to when they were 22 and 23 and you play those songs. And then everybody comes up afterwards and says, "Oh, you're a genius. You know exactly the songs I like." No, I just know how old you are. Because people stop listening to new music. I never did. I never have. If I never hear a record from the 70s again, I'll be okay. At least the ones I know best, because I've heard them. I've heard them too many times. So I continue to listen. It's only in the last few years that I've started to find it hard to listen to some new forms of music, like some of the stranger directions that hip hop is taking recently, like trap and dubstep. I just find it too discordant for my ears. I can't do it anymore. I still like hip hop, but the particular sound it has right now, and it's a good thing in a way. It's because if I understood it and I liked it at 56, that seems to me to indicate that the music is wrong. Old people should hate their kids' music.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, that's a good. Well, yeah. It's interesting.
Your music should piss your dad off.
All right. Probably in the future, when I reflect to my childhood, I found that what a terrible childhood. So until now, I still recall the time when I had the lecture of Monkey Beach. So you mentioned that you have one sentence that made me feel impressive. Like the real scary thing is not the story, but the history. I recently read the book, and the impression for me is truly what you mean. Like you convey the most astonishing things is that something were more or less happening on themselves. So also there are some novels with the context of war, such as World War II, such as there is a novel called All the Light We Cannot See. This background with that. It kind of two characters with a different background, but it was the battle with the context of wars. So from your perspective, how does history influence literature from the past, present, and what may cause by this influence?
Well, if you're looking for things if art is about things that move us, the things we can do and have done to each other as a species are as oppressive and as damaging and as violent as anything our imaginations have ever dreamed up. And that's part of what I was trying to get at in Monkey Beach when I said that in Monkey Beach what's scary is not ghosts, it's history. Because for Lisa Marie and her family, the place they live in is literally marked by the residue, the scars of colonization, of things like the smallpox epidemic that wiped out the village they walked through, things like the legacy of the residential school system. Mm-hmm. So, in one sense, the very general answer is simply that if art is about tragedy, there's a lot of tragedy in history. So if you're looking for content, if you're looking for source material, go to history, because there's no shortage of suffering. But they're due to two different media. They're two different things, right? The historian has to deal with the facts and is trying the best they can to say what actually happened. The artist can afford to ignore the facts and change the facts in order to focus in on what matters, right? If they get to the theme or meaning and so they're both dealing with the same object, but approaching it for a very different end, and using different techniques. So it's kind of a waffling answer. I mean, one, art looks to history for source material, for content. Two, art changes history in order to emphasize the meaning rather than the details. And that's not me. That's Aristotle, for God's sakes. That's basically his reading on the difference between the two.
Okay, it's good. It's not an awful answer. I find it interesting. Okay, so from our course, we have seen the past and the presence of literature, right? So in the past, we value some emotions such as love, But in recent years, the focus tend to be more personal, like privacy, equality. Meanwhile, we're also looking for a future. So, in your mind, what's the shape of the future of literature? Will it become more personal, or like the smartest kids in the world to be more filled with images, become more prevalent like this, like comic books, or what kind of future do you think the literature will become?
Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, I don't expect it will change all that much. The kinds of stories that we tell don't really change all that much. There's only a few basic plots, because the things that move us are and matter to us. I mean, birth, marriage, love, death, tragedies. In order to imagine a completely different literature, we'd have to imagine a completely different species, right? We'd have to be different people. So I don't imagine the kinds of stories we tell. We'll tell them in slightly different ways. We're always figuring out new ways to do it. I don't know. The only thing I would say is that the only thing I'm halfway confident about is regarding the book itself, rather than the stories it tells. I think what's likely to happen with the book is it's likely to become something like a fetish object, something like an art object, much more than a mass market commodity, and that the number of serious readers will go back to what they were before we had this brief blip in the late 19th and 20th century where reading literature became actually a popular. And because there are other forms of narrative now. I mean, for your generation, correct me if I'm wrong, but the main way you experience and get pleasure from narrative has got to be from video games at this point, rather than from books, like just in sheer numbers, right? And then they're still telling the same stories, right?
But in a more like physical way, you have the images, you have the sound.
Yeah. But the basic plot is the same, right? These are old stories, just retold in a different format. So I think the number of people who read and appreciate serious books is likely to only keep getting smaller in the foreseeable future. And there's nothing wrong with that. This was never really a mass market thing. It was always, reading serious books has always been a fairly elite pleasure. And I don't mean elite in the sense of, class or education, though those things factor in. I mean, these just aren't pleasures that appeal to a large number of people. They're pleasures that appeal to a few. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's okay. In fact, thinking that books have to be for everybody, if you're a writer, that's kind of death. Like, I must make my book for everybody. At the end of that road is Rupi Kaur.
So can I understand your point? Like, the literature could be hidden in some other ways.
Yeah,
like video games,
not literature,
songs,
narrative, right? Then they're different things. Narrative is just story. We have a fundamental human need for stories, to hear them, to be part of them. And right now, the main vehicle for delivering narrative to most people between the ages of 20 and 40 is almost certainly video games. Like, just in terms of copies sold, so my son is extremely excited because he's just read that the next installment of Assassin's Creed is going to be set in the Viking era. Yeah. And so, that's it's an old story, right? Vikings, for God's sakes. We've had those in novels. We've had those in movies. But now you're getting them in video games. And that's okay.
So you can accept it.
Yeah, I like video games.
Okay.
I'm playing one right now that's kind of freaky. It's called Vampire, or maybe Vampire. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Vampyr. And the weird thing about it, do you know the game?
I don't know, but I heard it's interesting.
Yeah, so the weird thing about it right now is that it's set in London. You're a doctor who becomes a vampire. and it's set in London during the Spanish flu epidemic. So I'm playing it now, and there's in the game there's like posters up about, you know, warning contagion, stay in your homes, wear masks. And then, you know what's happening outside, right? The parallel is bizarre between I'm playing a game about the Spanish flu in the middle of the COVID-19 virus, and that feels strange.
Quite a circle
Yeah,
around a circle.
yeah.
Well, it's actually beyond my expectation. Like probably I suppose that you're assuming that probably literature is gonna developing in such a way. But it's quite astonishing about me about that you're not like it couldn't be identified in other people when it compares. Like you also play video games, you have also some other interests that not only focusing on literature or books, which is quite beyond my expectation before.
And they feed different pleasures, right? Like different, and you know, humans need entertainment. And we need you can't spend your whole time on sort of serious thoughts, right? Like,
or you'll be tired. Yeah, I know that right? Feeling.
Yeah,
because once a time I've read for a whole day, and I skipped a little bit for about 2 months. I haven't read a book even months because it's quite. Sometimes they're constricting you from releasing you.
Yeah. You know, it's good to know that they're there when you need them. That's all.
Okay. So, next question: like, not only books in our reading list, but also some other famous novels and films apply symbolism as their way to demonstrate the stories. You know, the Israeli person in Prufrock's the world at his time. The cat is the pollution, right? In the lighthouse, to the lighthouse itself represents reconciliation. In Things Fall Apart, Yam represents masculinity and symbolizes a conquer. Right? So why do I think symbolism is important to these writers? And you can see that symbolism is much more a prevailing style to be used in at least Western writers. But for me, from my perspective, in some of Chinese traditions or Chinese typical novels, you don't see, they barely apply symbolism to describe a thing or to depict a process or an event. What do you think of the difference? Why do you think symbolism for Western writers are so important?
So you would say that in Chinese writing, they don't tend to use symbols?
It could be understood in that way, but but they probably I don't think they will describe the role as if an Israelite person, but they could use probably Yam to describe to symbolize masculinity. Do you think it is the difference of imagination or certain relevance?
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. Are there cultural differences in the way we use in how we suggest what it is that we want art to suggest? There's a difference, first of all, between symbolism and symbols, right? Symbolism is usually thought of as a movement, a literary movement, historical period. So we're talking late 19th century, Charles Baudelaire, French poets. Virginia Woolf is not a symbolist writer. She's just a writer who uses a symbol, and in her case, actually a symbol she said wasn't a symbol at all. It was just a lighthouse that she meant nothing by it, remember? Mm-hmm. So, let's just confine it to not symbolism, but writers who use symbols, and why is it that Western writers appear to like them and Chinese writers appear not to, right? All a symbol is a way to use a particular to suggest a universal, right? Because the universal, whatever the thing you're pointing at, masculinity, home,
Reconciliation.
reconciliation, it's too big to be described in words, right? It's too big and fuzzy, right? So
Mhm.
you point to it by using, so say what you're trying to point to is harbor, home, use a lighthouse, right? Because
Mhm.
you can't sum up everything that home means. So you put a lighthouse in the play and that in the movie, and that tells your audience what they want to think. I gotta believe that I know nothing about. I've read maybe one contemporary Chinese. No, I've even read one Chinese novel. It's horrible. I have not. I don't read enough in translation. You have to give me a reading list when we're done.
Oh, okay.
So here's the thing. I have to believe, because we're both human, that home and love and reconciliation and masculinity, those things matter as much to Chinese readers and Chinese writers as they do to Western readers and Western writers, right? The So all that could be different is how you suggest them. So if there's no symbols, what happens in Chinese literature? You just
Or
say
just, or
the word home.
it could not. It don't necessarily need to relate to Chinese literature. You could just mention why symbolism is very prevalent in Western
Yeah,
literature.
yeah, but it's an interesting question. And I think so. That's my answer. Is simply that a symbol is a shortcut. It's a way to. Some of this has to do. If you were to do a sort of deeper dive into this, um, some of this almost certainly in the West has to do with the incredibly powerful hold of Christianity upon our artistic imagination. That at the core of Christianity is symbols, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is a cross,
Mm-hmm.
is the sacrament, is
Resurrection.
it's loaded and laced with physical things, like the host, for example, the bread that the Catholics use to represent the body of Christ, or the cross. You, you know, that it's loaded with things that use particular objects to suggest undescribably vast, undescribable objects, gods, divinities. And so maybe we've been taught by a couple of thousand years in the West
Mm-hmm.
to associate serious thinking with symbols. And so some of the reason that we use symbols in art so much is because Christianity taught us to. I don't know.
Well, let's see. Grid is a great kind of relation. Bad idea. If you hear the noise, just ignore this. This is
It's okay.
noise from the construction outside.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I found it interesting on one of your TV show. Like you introduced your new book in a TV show, right? A few years before. Like you were talking about your latest book, Arrival, and one point you mentioned was interesting and fascinated me. Like uh, I quote your words, but in paraphrased them a little bit. Like the Canadian literature is an epitaph for Canada because when it arrives, they become non-necessary. So, what characteristics do the author in the last century have so that they are recognized as representation of Canadian literature?
Sorry, I missed so back up. What was your paraphrase again?
Like, Canadian literature is an epitaph for Canada
An
because when
epitaph?
yeah, for Canada, it's the content in your book. Because when it arrives, they become unnecessary.
Yeah, I'm not sure I remember saying that or what I meant. Um, I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah, all I meant there was that um, the Canadian literature, the period that book was about in the 1960s, a lot of it
Mm-hmm.
was concerned with the nation, was concerned with what Canada meant, particularly what Canada meant in relationship to the United States, how it was different from the United States. And a good part of that came from an anxiety about whether Canada had an identity, and more pointedly, had a literature. And so my point, I think, then was just that once we created it, once we got that Canadian literature, questions been asked and answered. So you no longer need anything like a national literature. You just got books now, because the question doesn't bother us, doesn't preoccupy us the same way it did in the 1960s. The question about national identity and national literature, because we have one. So you don't need to keep asking those questions. But that wasn't your question, right? What was your question about?
Like, what characteristics do the authors in the last century, like in 1960s, have that they are recognized as Canadian literature or Canadian authors?
And I mean, last century, that's a long period of time, right? A lot of, so I'll just do the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
God, there's not a lot. I mean, there's such a fractious bunch. There's such a wide range of.
You could choose a specific example.
A specific example, I would say one thing is that that was greater than recently, though it might come again, is a dislike of and concern with the behavior of the United States. There's a lot of sort of pronounced anxiety about American cultural and imperial power, shading over into outright anti-Americanism, hatred of America. And that's pretty common and ubiquitous in the Canadian literature of the 1960s and 70s, in various forms.
So you mean that the hatred towards Americanism?
Well, you got to remember, this is Vietnam, right? You know, there's a lot of and this concern about American cultural imperialism. So, you know, their television shows taking over Canadian networks. We don't worry about those things anymore because they're all international now, right? Netflix knows no borders. But they did worry about those things then. It did bother them that when they went into their bookstores, most of the books they were getting were not by them or for them. We don't care anymore. We used to, once upon a time, we used to put Canadian books in a separate section of the bookstore, and there's maple leaf flags on them, you know, so you'd say, these are the Canadian books. We don't do that anymore. We mix them in with all the others. And partly that's a consequence of the success of Canadian literature. Now it can play on the big stage, right? But a much more pronounced preoccupation with cultural identity, and especially in relationship to its much more powerful neighbor to the south. I would say that's one of the main hallmarks of literature of the 1960s.
So, like you also mentioned, like the fading nationalism from 1960s.
Yeah, I mean,
it is in 1970s, right?
It's at its peak then. Yeah, it's at its peak then. Really, Canadian nationalism sort of peaks in 1967, Canada's birthday, and then it might. It's showing signs right now of a kind of rebirth, and for some of the same reasons, right? The anxiety about American behavior. So it's possible to come back, but yeah, until recent events, nationalism was largely a spent cultural force in Canada. Spent cultural force, exhausted. No longer a source of identity or artistic inspiration. We're post-national now. You know, if you want to, just an example of this, like Margaret Atwood's stuff in the 1960s and 70s, her novels were intensely about Canadian identity, Canadian concerns. They're elegies for a lost way of life, a lost Canadian way of life that's being taken over by American cultural imperialism. She's still writing elegies, but they're for the species now, right? They're about climate change, not about America anymore. The Handmaid's Tale, but that's a book from the 80s redone. Anyway, I just think our writers have different concerns now. I don't think they're largely national concerns anymore.
So you're afraid of post-nationalism, the fading of nationalism.
Yeah, they've embraced post-nationalism. We're all post-nationals now.
You know? So you accept it?
Yeah, I don't have much of a choice. I mean, because Amazon, because Netflix, you know, it's in the nature of capitalism. Capitalism does not like borders. capitalism doesn't like nationalism. They're uneasy bedfellows.
Mhm. So probably you get institutionalized. You get used to it.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
you do.
It could be a positive thing, but it could be a negative thing.
That's
It's a gray area.
That's
Like it's
exactly
not
right.
black and white.
That's
It's hard
exactly.
to argue.
I like Netflix.
It's a good thing. I
Yeah.
realize.
Yeah.
So there are several comments in today's society that literature or arts programs are not practical. So they are not constructive nor allowing people to get their jobs. So what do you think of the comments like this?
It's true, but if I mean, every once in a while somebody will try to make the argument, and there's something to this, that yes, they are practical, that being able to think and to write and to speak, that these things are skills that have a market, that employers find useful, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. I know alumni who are working happily in many, many different areas of life, not all writers. So the ability to think and speak and write and just a wide cultural knowledge, those things can be practical skills, but that's not the primary benefit of studying. I don't think of studying the arts or of experience of the art. It's not the primary benefit of the arts themselves.
You mentioned that in the first class.
Yeah,
it's not for you to get a job.
Yeah, it's not what it's about. I mean, if you really wanted to get a job, go to a community college and take a course, and I don't know, like whatever that's designed to help you get a job, right?
Mm-hmm.
But and because I this is probably my most dearly held conviction, is that I think it's important to have some things in our life that are useless, that don't have value in the way capitalism in particular decides it. That is something that can be exchanged for currency. I think it's incredibly important because to be human is much more than to be a worker, right? It's to be a member of your community. It's to be a member of your family. It's to be an individual. And all of our emphasis on education is on creating and crafting one particular narrow little facet of your identity as a human being, the worker. There's other parts of you that needs feeding, and that's all. I think there should be time in our lives for stuff that doesn't have economic value, stuff that we do just because it makes us happy to do it. That's all. And story.
Something useless.
Yeah, useless. You understand how I'm using the term, right? Useless as it is defined by a capitalist economy, right? Because the capitalist economy says that to be useful means that it has a practical value, that it can be exchanged for a monetary value. And there's nothing exchangeable about the transaction at the heart of art.
It's interesting. And the next one is brief. So far, what's your favorite novel?
Oh my God.
It can have a list, or it can have alternatives that they are belonging to your favorites.
Yeah, I have a really hard time with those kind of questions. I'll just give you a recent favorite as opposed to an all-time favorite, because I can't do that. I really like, there's a new novel by a Vancouver writer by Michael Christie. I think he's in Vancouver. It's called Greenwood. Michael Christie, Greenwood. It's a long novel. And it's sort of about climate change. It's a post-apocalyptic novel with an astonishing story and a lot of heart and a lot of he does his homework. I love the way that it wears its learning very lightly, but it's learned, and it's got some important things to say. I thought it was fantastic. Michael Christie's Greenwood. I don't know what else I got. So I think I've read these. I see. All my books are still at my office, right?
Oh yeah.
So anyway, that's my pick.
Okay, so Greenwood is your recent favorite book, right?
I would have said, and once upon a time I used to say Lolita.
Lolita?
Yeah, Lolita, but I don't know.
How about some traditional books like uh, Don Quixote? Or
Never read it.
okay, okay.
Never read it. You wouldn't believe the number of books I've never read, Richard. I
Uh,
never read Paradise Lost. Never read Don
you have a
Quixote.
reason, or
Pardon me?
do you have
I've
a
never.
reason for not reading it? Or
Just God, too many books, not enough time. Part of it is that I'm a specialist in Canadian literature, and partly that I was trained as a specialist in early Canadian literature. So I've read more books that nobody else in the world has read, um, or should read, quite frankly. And a lot of the big books that everybody has read and I should read. I spent a lot of time reading. I probably
Canada.
spent too many. Yeah, I probably spent too many years reading bad books. Maybe it's time to read good. But the thing is, if you don't read bad books, how would you know a good book? That's always been my justification.
Inspirational.
So, yeah.
So, well, we come to our last question. Well, it's a quite general question that is depends on your like. So, what does literature mean to you? What do you think the most fascinating thing for you to read literature throughout your time? It's a huge question, I know, because select some specific question or examples they want to point it out.
I don't know. We talk a lot. Or I talk a lot in lecture classes about its ability to introduce us to worlds that we don't know, and get us to empathize with people that are different from ourselves and see the world through different eyes. And I think that's all true. But for me, the most powerful moments of in literature and what it ultimately means and why it has value to me is much more likely to be based on affinity rather than difference. That is, regardless of how different our circumstances might be, the character and myself, in different race, different time, different place, they're experiencing something that I have experienced or know I will experience. And you feel that moment of identification. Oh my God, yes, that's what it feels like right there. You've nailed it. And so I suspect for me that's part of it. That's the biggest part. I also just like, and this is getting increasingly hard for me, but I like just getting lost in narrative, just forgetting the world and just entering into another world. That's to me the authentic pleasure of reading is simply, it's an immersion. And that is getting increasingly difficult for me to do, partly because I'm a teacher, right? So it's very hard for me to read for pure pleasure anymore. Anytime I read, I've got a pencil in my hand mentally because I'm taking notes. I'm thinking about how am I going to teach this? How am I going to write about it? But it's that the pleasure of reading, which is getting lost in another world. Those two things.
Get useless.
Yeah, exactly. Both useless. Yeah, both useless.
Mm-hmm. So we're done here.
Okay.
So that's all the questions. Well, I have a kind of confession, like something like confession to end this interview because it's quite meaningful to me. I prepared for this for almost a month, so I have some impressions and some gratitude to you. So, but well, first I am grateful to have Professor in this interview. So it's my first time. If you like you have any questions after all, you have any suggestions like after the interview,
Okay.
you could just email me.
No, I thought they were great questions. So you put a lot of work into this, and you've always been like a deeply engaged student, somebody who is getting more out of this course than the grades or the credit. That's what education is, right? 100 years from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, the grades aren't going to matter. The credit's not going to matter. It's what you take with you. It's the experience you have. That's what the value is. And you are one of the students who gets that experience.
Okay, I really enjoyed the experience from the first time when I was young and innocent child from entering the university until now, I got used to it. So I I have a impression on literature, at least in Catholic. For me, it's constantly an interest from the comic book to fairy tales, from the Little Prince to Don Quixote. Well, I mentioned Don Quixote recently because I read it recently. It's a fascinating book. I really suggest it to recommend you to read it because it's a little bit longer if you wanted to.
What's that? Which one are you talking about now? The
Don
Little
Quixote
Prince?
by
Oh,
70s.
Don Quixote, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Don Quixote by 70s. The fading value of night, right? Literature for me is the study of human nature. It incorporates people's do's and do nots and gives us the depiction of their time. So I'm deeply allured by the words that every author has written in our course. Concerns to this world, the family story on an island in Scotland, the fading village in Africa, lost birds in England, etc. So these works and all the literature works I read constitutes my today's points of view, and probably influence my life in the future. I have to say that I am definitely not the best scorer in this course, but I'm doing my best to be a best reader. So professor once concluded the nation's literature in a sentence. I don't know whether in an interview or in a passage. He said that there's nothing there and there's nothing there. What I would like to say is that probably they came late, but at least they have ever come. So they led us to stay away from vulgarity and ignorance, but to see the sagacity the authors have mind on themselves. They left a legacy to remind us the beauty of our past, to be vigilant with the present, and to be hopeful in the future. So at last, what I want to say is that there's nothing there, but our generation are hoping to have something here, to make something happen, and always be optimistic with the things that are about to happen. So thank you very much, Professor, for your attendance. And
You're welcome.
I may insist on this series to to interview with more professors or scholars that I'm interested with. So it's my great honor to invite you to my interview.
No,
So much.
thanks for doing it, Richard. Take care of yourself, okay?
Yeah.